Hello and welcome to Jason's Macintosh Museum. I'm Jason, your host, and today we're looking at a Macintosh LC III from 1993. Now, to the average person, the LC III looks very much like its predecessors, the LC and LC II, in that all three of them share the same pizza box style case, which makes them very compact and very easy to work with. But that's really where the similarities end, because the LC III really, you could say, was the first proper LC model, in that it was the very first model of LC that did not have any deliberate compromises built into its design. Now, to explain what I mean by that, we need to look at the previous models in the LC family, starting with the original Macintosh LC, launched in 1990. Now, the LC really was Apple's first attempt to create a low-cost machine, mainly for the educational market, specifically actually a low-cost colour Macintosh, because prior to that point, if you wanted a colour Macintosh, you had to buy something like a 2CX or 2CI, which were quite expensive. So the LC came out as a very low-cost machine, and it served its purpose quite well. But unfortunately, to keep the cost of the machine down, Apple had to introduce, well, they didn't have to, but they chose to introduce several compromises that really did limit the machine's appeal. First of all, the original LC had a Motorola 68020 CPU and no floating point unit, nor did it have a memory management unit, which meant that you couldn't do complex floating point calculations efficiently, and you couldn't use virtual memory. And added to that was the fact that they ran the 020 CPU on a 16-bit data bus, which severely limited the machine's performance. And on top of that, they only allowed you to use up to 10 megabytes of system memory, which really, at the time, was acceptable, but certainly it limited the machine's future expansion capabilities. When Apple introduced the LC's replacement, the LC2, in 1992, you would have thought that Apple would have taken the opportunity to improve on the LC and to really fix all of the compromises that the original LC had. Unfortunately, they didn't. What they did was, well, in terms of improvements, what they did was they took the LC's 020 CPU and replaced it with the Motorola 68030 CPU, which meant that you could use virtual memory. However, there was still no floating point unit, not even the ability to add one on the logic board, and what's worse, it was still on a 16-bit data bus, and you could still only use 10 megabytes of memory. But because the LC2 had 4 megabytes as standard, rather than the LC's 2 megabytes, to get 10 megabytes, you had to install 12 by installing two 4 megabyte SIMs. So at the end of the day, you had 2 megabytes of your memory that was inaccessible. So it was really a very belated attempt to upgrade the LC. Thankfully, in 1993, Apple released this machine, the LC III, and this machine finally broke free of all the compromises and limitations of both the LC and LC2. First of all, Apple upgraded the CPU again to a 25 MHz Motorola 68030, but crucially, you had the ability to add a 68882 floating point unit if you wanted to. And as well, the CPU was now running on a full 32-bit data bus. And in addition to that, you could expand the system memory up to 36 megabytes rather than the 10 megabytes of the LC and LC2. And crucially, if you added the extra memory, there was no issue with memory becoming unavailable for use, because by adding a single 32 megabyte 72-pin SIM, you added that to the 4 megabytes of onboard memory and you had all 36 megabytes available. So all in all, the LC3 was a huge improvement in both functionality and performance over the LC2. And so what you ended up with was more or less the performance of a Macintosh 2CI, give or take, given the 2CI had a floating point unit as standard, but you had that performance in the same small, compact pizza box case that the LC was known for. I should also mention, in terms of performance, that compared to the previous LC2, the LC3 was about twice as fast, so big improvement there. So you could say that the LC3 was the machine that the original LC should have been from the start. But that's just how Apple chose to do it. And an interesting bit of trivia on the Macintosh LC3, there was actually another model released in this line known as the LC3 Plus. Now the LC3 Plus was identical to the 3 except that it used a 33 MHz 030 CPU rather than the 25 MHz CPU of the LC3. But strangely enough, the external case and the badging was identical. You would expect the badge to say LC3 Plus, but it didn't. It still said LC3. So there was no way to tell them apart unless you looked inside. But it turns out I do have an LC3 Plus, which will be the subject of a later video. Okay, well, let's talk about the specifications of the Macintosh LC3. It was launched in February of 1993 and discontinued in February of 1994. It came with a 25 MHz Motorola 68030 CPU on a 32-bit data bus, and you could have an optional 68882 numeric coprocessor. It came with 4 MB of onboard memory as standard, expandable up to 36 MB, which was basically more than 3 times the memory capacity of its predecessor. You also got either an 80 or 160 MB hard disk and a built-in 1.4 MB SuperDrive. And just like the other LCs that preceded it, you got an LC PDS processor direct slot for expansion. And this was normally used for something like an onboard Ethernet card, but it's worth noting that one of the cards that was designed for use with the LC series was the Apple IIe system card, which was basically an entire Apple IIe system on a chip, which was then placed on a PDS card that allowed an LC, LC2 or LC3, in fact any LC model with the appropriate PDS slot and 24-bit addressing, to emulate in hardware a proper Apple IIe. Now it turns out I do have a working Apple IIe card, so as soon as I round up some Apple II software to test it with, I'll be showing that in a later video. Okay, well that's about all there is to say about the Macintosh LC3, so now let's have a closer look at it. Now before I have a closer look at the Macintosh LC3, it's interesting to note that the LC3 was one of the Macintosh models produced during the time when Apple was transitioning between their auto-inject floppy drive and the manual inject floppy drive. And a bit of background on that in case you're not familiar with what I mean, is that all Macintosh models built up until the early 1990s, circa 1993-94, had what was called an auto-inject floppy drive. And that drive was designed so that as you insert the floppy disk into the drive, just as you're about to insert it all the way in, the drive mechanism will grab the disk and load it automatically. And that allows the Macintosh to have a very flush, flat floppy drive slot in the front. Now what happened after that, around 1994, Apple decided, I presume in an attempt to cut costs, they chose to use a cheaper floppy drive mechanism known as a manual inject floppy drive. And the difference with that was that in order to load the disk, you had to insert it all the way into the slot, completely in, before the disk would then drop down and load. Now what that meant was, although the drive mechanism was a lot cheaper and simpler, it meant that the front panel of the machine, or in particular the floppy drive slot, had to be redesigned. So the LC3 is a good example. So here we have two LC3s. The one on the left was built in, I believe it was July of 1993. And this is the original style of the LC3. And you can see that the floppy drive slot is completely flat and flush. And that's because this model uses an auto-inject floppy drive. And in fact, if I insert a disk, you'll see what I mean. If I insert it, as I'm about to insert it all the way, you can see that the drive grabs the disk and loads it. Now, on the right, we have another LC3, but this one is a later production LC3, which was built, I believe, in late 1993 and early 1994. And this model uses the manual inject floppy drive. And you can see that the floppy drive slot looks a bit different. As you can see, the slot has been widened in the middle, and that's to allow you to insert your finger all the way into the slot in order to load the disk. So if I grab another disk, you'll see what I'm referring to. So with this one, I have to push the disk all the way in. Even this far, it's still not loading. I have to push it all the way in before the disk will load. And so what that allowed Apple to do was to use a much cheaper floppy drive mechanism, but it also, I think, made the machine a little bit, well, not as nice to use, I think. But what they also did, of course, when they redesigned the floppy drive slot, they also redesigned the front panel. And as you can see, this is what the newer LC3 looks like. And it's also worth noting that there's a little bit more of Apple's clever cost cutting here, because on the original LC3, the entire badge was printed on the case. So in other words, for the original LC, LC2, LC3, they had to print the entire model name on the case. But on the newer LCs, the Apple logo and the Macintosh badge, which of course were consistent across all models, was printed on the case or stuck on the case, but the model name itself was printed on a separate label that was actually stuck to the case below it. So that meant that Apple could print the labels for different models of LC, whether it was the 2, the 3, or the 475, and they could use the same top cover with the same Apple logo, the same Macintosh badge, and simply stick the appropriate label onto the machine depending on what the model was. So again, a little bit of clever cost cutting there. All right, so now what we'll do is I'll quickly get the other LC3 out of the way and look at the actual LC3 here. I should mention those two models are identical internally. The only difference is the external case and the floppy drive mechanism. Right, so here's the front view of the Macintosh LC3, and just like the LC and LC2, same style of case, very small, pizza box style, very compact, very easy to work with, and not much to see on the front. As you can see, we've got the Apple logo and Macintosh LC3 tag here. And then across from that, we have the 1.4 megabyte auto-inject SuperDrive. And that's all there is on the front. Now there's nothing on the side, so I'll quickly turn it around, just like that. And here's the back. So on the back, we've got the two tabs that you need to release in order to take the top cover off. And note that these can become very brittle with age, so be very careful when you're lifting up on these to remove the top cover. And then below that, we've got the power switch and power inlet. And this power switch is a physical on-off power switch because just like the LC and LC2, the LC3 does not support soft power, so you have to turn the machine on and off with this power switch. Then moving on from there, we have the external monitor port, printer and modem ports, external SCSI, ADB, audio out and microphone in. And then here we have a blanking plate for the LC PDS card if one were installed. Just like other LC models, Apple places the serial number, data production tag and the other product information on the underside of the case. So I've got the LC now tipped up on its front, and here is the product information tag. Model M1254 assembled in Malaysia, and all the various certifications, whatever they mean. And right down the front we have the information tag here, manufactured July 1993, and there's the serial number. Taking a Macintosh LC3 apart is simplicity itself, mainly because it's so well designed inside, and you can take the whole machine apart without, I don't believe, without any tools at all. So let's start. So the first step is taking off the top cover. Now to do that, there are two tabs on the back, one here, one over here, that you have to lift up on carefully to release, and then the front panel will lift off, or the top cover and front panel will lift off. They're one unit. But as I mentioned, you have to be very careful when pulling up on these two tabs because they can snap off. In fact, to give you an idea, here's another LC3 I've got, and you can see what's happened to the top cover. You can see how the two tabs are broken clean off. I'd say it happened before I got it, but I'd say the previous owner was a little bit too forceful when pulling up on the tabs. So pull up on them very, very carefully, just like that, until you feel them release, and then lift, and the top cover comes off. So what we have now is the internals: hard drive over here, floppy drive here, power supply here, logic board here, cooling fan over here, and speaker here. And that's really all there is to it. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take out the hard disk. Now to do that, we have to unplug the power cable here and the data cable here. And we have 4 tabs we have to release. 2 on this side, 2 on this side. So what I do is I apply upward pressure here, and then I very carefully move the tabs out of the way. Oops, and lift the drive up enough so that it clears the tabs. Again, these tabs can also break if you apply too much force, so be careful. And we do the same on this side, lift up and lift up. So now the drive is out of the system. There we go. So what we'll do now is we'll take out the floppy drive. Now the floppy drive, there's the connector here for it, so we'll just unplug that. Okay. Now we have to move these 2 tabs outwards while lifting up on the back of the drive. So when you do that, the back of the drive is free, slide the drive forward, and it comes straight out. Now we'll take out the speaker. The speaker connector is up here. Unplug that. And then to remove the speaker, there's one tab here you have to pull back on while pulling up on the speaker, and it comes out just like that. Next, we'll take out the cooling fan. The connector is here, and there's a tab on either side of the fan, so just move them out while carefully pulling up on the fan, and it comes out. Now we'll take out the power supply. One connector here for that. Just pull up on that carefully to release it. And there is a tab here and a tab over here that we need to pull back on. Now for this side, there we go, that's out, and pull this tab out, and that releases the front of the power supply. Lift up, pull back, and out comes the power supply. Last item to remove is the logic board. And again, very simple to do. One tab here, one tab over here. So I like to apply a bit of pressure on the back on one of the ports while I move the tab out, and I carefully push the board forward while I do that. You see the board is now forwards, and once you move it far enough forwards, there are little cutouts on the side of the board that line up with these 2 pins. When they're lined up, you can lift the board straight up and out. And that's it. Nothing left to take out. Right, well that's the LC3 disassembled. So what we'll do now is have a closer look at the components. Okay, here is the logic board out of the Macintosh LC3. And of course the form factor is the same for the LC and LC2. So of course you could upgrade an LC or LC2 with an LC3 logic board if you wanted. So starting from the top, we've got the info focus. Come on, focus. Here we go. Apple Computer Incorporated, copyright 1992. All the various ports up on the top here. Here's the digital to analog converter for the onboard video, and the onboard video RAM down here. Now I believe the LC3 comes with 512K of video RAM on board, which you can expand up to 1 megabyte by putting a video RAM SIM in this slot over here. Moving on from there, we've got probably the serial port controllers. There's the SCSI controller right there. There's the CUDA chip there that controls the PRAM, real-time clock, and ADB as well, I believe. And here is the expansion socket for the optional 68882 numeric coprocessor, something the LC and LC2 did not offer. And moving on from there, we've got it's probably the sound chip there. Then here is the LC PDS expansion slot. Here's the main CPU, the Motorola 68030, running at 25 megahertz on a 32-bit data bus as well, thank goodness. The two ROM chips underneath. And here is the 4 megabytes of onboard memory. Now, what else have we got? Right, and here is the single 72-pin SIM slot for memory expansion. So by putting a SIM of up to 32 megabytes in this slot, you can take the LC3 up to 36 megabytes of memory, which is quite respectable, and certainly beats the hell out of the 10 megabytes you could take the LC and LC2 up to. Power supply connector down here, and the floppy drive connector there. Speaker and cooling fan connectors here. SCSI connector there for the hard disk. That's where the PRAM battery would go. Power supply connector there for the power connector for the hard disk. And that's about it, I believe. Okay, well that's the logic board out of the Macintosh LC3. So we'll have a look now at the hard disk. Okay, here is the hard disk out of the Macintosh LC3, and this I can confirm was the original disk that shipped with the system when it was new. So this one is a Quantum ProDrive ELS, made in Japan, and it's an original Apple branded 80 megabyte unit. So that's the front of the disk. If we quickly flip it over, you see we've got the various. Let's see, we've got the termination resistors up here because, of course, this is a SCSI disk. There's the jumpers for the SCSI ID over there. Various chips there. It's probably the ROM chip in the socket there. And that's the connector that links the controller to the drive's mechanism. And that's really all there is to see. Right, so that's the hard disk out of the Macintosh LC3. So we'll have a quick look now at the power supply. Okay, here is the power supply out of the Macintosh LC3, and I believe this is the same unit that was used in all the Pizza Box LC models, as in the LC 2, 3, 3 Plus, 475 and Quadra 605. And looking at it, I believe there were several different manufacturers who made these supplies, but I believe this one being a TDK, these are known for having problems with their internal capacitors. But I think this one is working just fine, so let's hope it keeps working. Anyhow, so it's not a very powerful power supply. As you can see, the outputs less than 4 amps on the 5 volt rail and less than 1 amp on the 12 volt rail. But when you think about it, given that the the Pizza Box LCs have no internal expansion apart from one slot, you don't really need a beefy power supply. And it's worth noting these actually don't have a fan in them either, because they probably don't get hot enough to need one. but that's pretty all we can see in the power supply. We've got the connector up here, not much on the back, and we've got the power inlet and power switch here. So just like the rest of the LC3, nice and simple. Okay, well that concludes our look at the Macintosh LC3. Well, it concludes part 1. So in part 2, once I reassemble the LC3, we'll power it up and show a couple of old Mac games, as usual. So, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for part 2.